Good evening, everybody. My name is Laura Mina. I'm the head librarian at the Charleston Library Society. It is such an honor to stand in front of all of you this evening, an audience so engaged and ever deepening your connection to literary arts and conversing about it so beautifully through the sessions of the Charleston Literary Festival. This evening's program, First Folio Felicitations, is generously supported by one of our city's most beloved authors and his lovely wife, Bernard and Judy Cornwell. The connection between the Cornwells and tonight's event is apropos, to say the least. One of Bernard's recent novels, Fools and Mortals, leans into and draws upon the Elizabethan world of William Shakespeare. I share this not just to illustrate the connection between the program and its supporters, but to highlight the fact that Shakespeare's impact is everywhere, and Charleston has had its own long history with it that continues into the present. On behalf of the Charleston Library Society, none other than Charles Coatsworth Pinckney became the first American subscriber to the Boydell publication of Shakespeare's dramatic works, evidence of the intellectual pursuits of Charlestonians in the earliest days of the early Republic, a benchmark. And while the Library Society doesn't have a First Folio, and wishes it did, if anybody knows of one, we can tout tracing our second folio to the collection beginning in 1813, another benchmark. In 2019, the Library Society received an exquisite gift from the Igo family, rare Elizabethan and Shakespearean materials, which included a fourth folio, beautifully bound in red Moroccan leather, and a quarto of Hamlet dating to 1676, a modern benchmark. And in this very moment, your attendance brings home the point that Charlestonians will continue to pursue Shakespeare into the future. So, a benchmark in this very moment. It's hard to imagine the world of today without Shakespeare, is it not? But as many of you already know, the heft, the breadth, and depth of his work was almost lost to history, were it not for the die-hard diligence and dedication of Shakespeare's friends, John Hemming and Henry Condell. Had it not been for their efforts to drive the publication of the First Folio forward, we know that half of its contents may have been lost forever. Imagine the world without Macbeth or The Tempest. With this knowledge in our minds, a 400th birthday celebration of the publication of the First Folio is actually the celebration of a miracle. And who better to bring us further into the fold of the legend of this event than the two gentlemen serendipitously sitting on stage tonight, Dominic Dromgoole and Bill Goldstein. Not only have these individuals been deeply entwined with Shakespeare, they are deeply entwined with the roots of the literary festival itself, having both been on stage in the first 2 years of the festival. The first time I encountered Dominic Dromgoole was actually when I heard him speak on the New York Times Book Review podcast. I was awestruck by his discussion with Pamela Paul. While at the artistic helm of the legendary Globe Theatre from 2006 to 2016, Dominic had adopted the mission to pointedly and purposely perform Shakespeare in every possible corner of the world. The book he was discussing with Pamela in 2017 was the tale of this endeavor. Hamlet, Globe to Globe, 2 years, 193,000 miles, 197 countries, one play. That's a lot. As if this accomplishment wasn't the feat of a lifetime, more recently, Dominic has produced a short film for each of Shakespeare's plays and founded Open Palm Film Company, through which he has produced 6 feature films and directed 1, Making Noise Quietly. In 2018, serving as artistic director of Classic Spring Theatre Company, he produced Oscar Wilde's 4 social comedies in London's West End, and in 2022, he published Astonish Me, First Nights That Changed the World, a Sunday Times Best Film and Theater book of that year. Bill Goldstein, who will be in conversation with Dominic, is also a Renaissance man of the literary world. I hope you both are feeling very good about this. Bill Goldstein reviews books and interviews authors for NBC's Weekend Today in New York, and was the founding editor of the New York Times Books website. A former lecturer in Shakespeare studies, Bill is a 2023-24 fellow at the Leon Levi Center for Biography at CUNY Graduate Center, where he is writing a biography of Larry Kramer, soon to be published by Crown. A true friend of the Charleston Literary Festival, Bill has perpetually supported this beautiful celebration in our community. In 2017, his book, The World Broke in Two, Virginia Woolf, T.S. Eliot, D.H. Lawrence, E.M. Forster, and the Year That Changed Literature came to the fore, celebrating the intellectual blossoming and evolution towards modernism in the era of Bloomsbury, and brought him to the stage here in Charleston. Please join me in welcoming these fantastic speakers back to Charleston to help us celebrate the miraculous publication of the First Folio. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I don't recognize myself. But one thing I now know we have in common is that we were both on the New York Times Book Review podcast being interviewed by Pamela Paul, and probably at almost the same time, since your book was published in 2017, and so was mine. So, so maybe a Google search will turn up both our names. But I wanted to talk, I mean, what we'll begin to talk about, I think, is what Laura was talking about, the importance of the First Folio. And what I'd like to do first is talk about why you think, or why the world thinks it's such an important book, and why the world does think of it as an important book, and then go back to what Shakespeare might have meant to people before the First Folio, and then what he's become afterwards. So can you say something about just why is the First Folio so important, both as a book of Shakespeare's plays, and also as a physical book itself? Why are we celebrating the 400th anniversary of that particular publication?
It's for me, it's a sort of contrary thing with the folio. Just to say also, it's just delightful to be back here. I love this city, and I'm so grateful to be here. I had a great time the first time I arrived for the very first Charleston Literary Festival, and it's nice to see that it's grown so powerfully and strongly into this extraordinary event. It's contrary with the folio. I always think of it like, I don't know if you remember, it wasn't Raiders of the Lost Ark, it was the third one, Indiana Jones and the Lost Crusade or something, Last Crusade. And at the end of it, Indiana Jones goes into a room and he's got a collection of sort of goblets, one of which is the Holy Grail. And it's like the casket scene in Merchant of Venice, where there's a gold and there's a silver and there's a lead, and of course the gold and the silver mislead you, and the true glory is found in the lead casket. In the same way, in the Indiana Jones film, you know, the evil Nazi picks up the sort of one that's encrusted with lots of jewels and diamonds and so on, and thinks that that's the Holy Grail because it's got all the bling power. But Indiana Jones, being a wise and modest and soulful man, goes straight for the humble cup. And that, I always think of that when I think of the folio. The folio itself is a very unprepossessing book. I've seen, I don't know how many now, I've seen 82 at the same time on a single wall in the Folger, in the heart of your country's capital, which I always think is the most sort of glorious and strange thing, is if you've got, you know, all within walking distance, Congress, Supreme Court, and then the Folger Library, which is where most of the folios in the world are held. And I've seen them in the Guildhall in London, and I've seen them in the British Library in London, and there's one at the Globe now, and I've seen them here, there, and everywhere. It's a very unprepossessing book. It's just a collection of papers. It's bound variously in different ways, and by different individuals over the last 400 years. So you don't approach it, it doesn't sort of exude an aura or let you know how powerful it is. But then when you open it and when you look into it and you see what's in there and you see how much everything that's in there matters and how much it's informed who we are, how we are with each other, how we build societies, how we build relationships, how we build families. An enormous part of how we understand ourselves and how we live our lives is taught to us, is helped is rehearsed in us by what's in that book. And without the First Folio, the other thing to say about the First Folio is it's a terrible book. It's really badly published, printed. It's chaotic and messy and scrappy, and you know, at points there's lots of words crammed into a page because they had to. At other points, they sort of got a lot of page and they haven't got a lot of words, so they sort of string it out. It's mistake after mistake after mistake after mistake after mistake. Midnight mushrooms from one of Prospero's speeches in The Tempest comes out as midnight mushrooms. And that's only one of many sort of catastrophic errors. So it's an amateur book. It's chaotically done by amateurs. It's not polished or elegant or perfected in any way. But it's a book of life. You know, there's no book in the world that's got so much life in it. And you feel that in its messiness and in its chaos. But when you do look into it and you find all of these extraordinary stories, all these extraordinary relationships, these extraordinary characters, and you think of what would have been lost, we would have lost The Tempest, and you know, which is one of our greatest meditations on art, and on letting go, and on how a man lets go of his daughter, and lets go of his art, and lets go of his rage. We'd have lost the Scottish play. I'm sorry, I'm coy. I call it the Scottish play. That would have gone, and that sort of brilliant diagnosis of how nihilism and evil walk together. We'd have lost Twelfth Night, which is, you know, the most exquisite comedy ever written about love, and sort of the beginning of a whole new voice in drama. We'd have lost Antony and Cleopatra. We'd have lost Julius Caesar, which means that Abraham Lincoln might still be alive. The dreadful Booth brothers would all have been trained up to be assassins by Shakespeare. We would have lost 18 of the plays. We'd lost As You Like It, which is, you know, the most evergreen Springfield celebration of young love and the exuberance of young love. All of those would have gone. So, what would have remained without that? We'd have thought of Shakespeare more as a historian, because there are actually only two, I think, of the history plays that were saved by the Folio. So his sort of telling of the story of England would have been a bigger factor in our understanding of him. And we would have had some great tragedies, and we would have had some great comedies, but the sheer magnificence of him, the size of him, the magnitude of him, the comprehensiveness of him, we probably wouldn't have appreciated in the same way. Also, I think we'll come on to, you know, how it was made and so on. Those plays that there were in quarto form, just to be absolutely clear, because sometimes I spent years not knowing what a quarto was or a folio was, but pretending I did, and sort of nodding. The folio is just a big book, a big, heavy, fat, substantial book. A quarto is a sort of perishable, small book that you can slip in your pocket and take round with you. Those Shakespeare plays that were published in quarto were very variable. There was no authorial voice, there was no authorial care in the publishing of them. So not only did the folio save half of the plays, it actually, as far as we know, was the most scrupulous editorial act on those of Shakespeare's plays that had already been published. So, I mean, you know, we would have lost Shakespeare, and I think to a certain degree we would have lost a big part of ourselves.
So you talk about the quartos and what those represented about Shakespeare, and then also what the folio does in revising some of those texts. And are you one of the people who, as a theatrical director, how do you make sense of the different versions, say, of Hamlet or of King Lear, when you are looking at the plays as theatrical pieces, as opposed to what scholars might look back on and try to make sense of as a scholarly text, or an annotated approach to how we decide what the final version of King Lear was.
I think that's one of the most exhilarating things about the folio and the quarto situation, is that there is no Platonic perfect text. There is no text. There's no, this is the absolute final version. And I think it's important to think of that because it does liberate you and it gives you freedom to explore the plays in the way you want to. I mean, the single most extraordinary thing about Shakespeare, which I can never get over or fully understand, is that he didn't care about the publication of his plays. He cared about the publication of his poems. He put his sonnets together in good shape and good order and sent them out into the world. He did the same with his longer poems. They mattered. The plays, Hamlet, King Lear, Hamlet, with, you know, what a piece of work as a man and to be or not to be, he just threw it to the wind. And he didn't mind about how it was published. It's sort of unfathomable, that. I go constantly trying to understand it. There's a playwright I know, a man called Richard Bean, who says that, you know, proofing a play is one of the most deadly and boring things that you can possibly do. And also it feels wrong to set something that should be alive, to sort of freeze something that should be molten and mobile. And I think with Shakespeare, you know, he cared about making money. He was a greedy bugger, and he made a lot of money from the theatre and bought big properties with it. He cared about the poems, as I say, but I think something in him was so fertile and so inventive that the idea of setting something down and the idea of sort of locking it was inimical to who he was as an artist. So what that means is that, say, with Hamlet, you have a terrible first version of Hamlet, which was pirate printed. There was a lot of pirate printing going on at the time. It was sort of lawless age. We don't know by whom. Could have been by someone. There was a theory that it was someone who went to see it and heard it and then reproduced what they could remember. There's a theory that the actor who played Marcellus in it was the person who took it to the printer because Marcellus suddenly becomes a very big, important character towards the end of the text in that version. And, you know, it's truly terrible. Is it to be or not to be? Aye, that's the point. Rather than to be or not to be, that is the question. So there's that version. Then there is a second quarto, which is full, rich, twice as long as the first one. And then there's the folio. So between the three, the differences are significant and vast, including where some scenes are placed and including where some speeches are placed. And so what the great thing about that is it sets you free to do sort of as you want. In terms of line for line, I tend to go to the folio, and I tend to try and use the folio punctuation as a guide to the actors, because I get the sense that there were actors involved in the making of it. They recorded the rhythm of it and the sound of it, and there's something about the punctuation that seems, even though it seems sometimes a bit nonsensical, it seems to have a music to it, like when you read a David Mamet play or a Carol Churchill play, and it's got very precise punctuation.
And so when you say this about Shakespeare not really caring or not seeming to care about how his plays were published, why did the people who put together the folio, why were they then making up for what they felt in some way? I mean, I know we can't know literally, but for the modesty of Shakespeare's interest in documenting his theatrical works? Are they writing a historical injustice, or Shakespeare was wrong about his own work?
We don't know. I mean, it's fascinating. Can we fill the gaps? I've just made a documentary about the creation of the First Folio, which is coming out this week in the UK. We're trying to get a feature film made about it as well, because it's just such a wonderful story. There are several significant factors. One of them is Shakespeare died in 1616, April 1616. November 1616, Ben Jonson, his great rival and friend, having died, does a massive Here I Am. producing his own folio, the first time that collected plays are produced in folio form. The Johnson folio is totally the opposite of the Shakespeare folio. It's very carefully done, it's very beautiful, it's very elegant, it's got a lot of space and empty paper on it, just a single line of verse per page. There's a picture of Johnson in the front with a laurel wreath around him. It's what the brilliant scholar Emma Smith calls Ben Jonson's ego in book form. And he's the opposite of Shakespeare. He does like getting everything right. He does like setting everything down. He does want it to be precise. He wants it to be a record of himself. And he wanted to be immortal, and being immortal mattered to him in a way it didn't to Shakespeare. And so there's a thought that that might have inspired the actors, who wouldn't, they knew each other, they knew Ben Jonson, they knew Shakespeare, going, oh my God, this is going to be the worst crime in history. Johnson's going to win. Johnson, whose plays, I don't know, some people like them, but his plays are going to survive forever, and our great friend Shakespeare's won't. So there might have been that. We also know that in Shakespeare's will, he left 26 shillings to Richard Burbage, who was the great actor of the company and whose family owned the theatre, Hemmings and Condell, his great friends. Now, was that an act of friendship, or was that part of a sort of early publishing pact? Was that an inspiration for them? The money was to buy mourning rings, which is a sort of common thing, but it seems to speak of a very special friendship. And, the task for these two actors who had no idea what they were doing, essentially, was an immense one, because the scripts were scattered, as far as we know. The Globe, as you probably remember, had burnt down in 1613, and at that point, everything that was contained within it was sort of scattered to the wind. Now, some of the plays would probably have been in Stratford with the family, some of them might have been in London where he lived, some of them might have been taken away by friends, some of them might have been with collaborators that he'd worked with. So they had to go out and find all of these plays to bring them together. And then they had to edit them and get them right. And then they had to get it printed. Two people that didn't know anything about printing, really, and find a publisher to sort of fund the whole venture and sort out this cat's cradle of complicated rights of the plays that had already been published, to get all of the people who were involved with those plays to come together to create a folio. So it was a heroic act. I mean, we have Shakespeare through Shakespeare being a genius, but we also have him, as much as anything, through Hemmings and Condell, and a group of collaborators who came together to create this remarkable book.
I mean, one of the things that I'm thinking as you're talking is, of course, the fragility of the historical record, I mean, the theatrical record, but the historical record, that if they're amassing, these texts, and then putting them into the form of the First Folio, it's amazing, sad, obvious in some way that all of this now is lost. I mean, people were not trying to preserve the manuscripts that they might have gathered from actors in some way. And so when you think of all the source material that you've just described that the First Folio is based on, and yet none of it exists, that there is no copy of manuscript copies of these plays, and yet as you were talking, I was thinking, well, there were a lot of actors in these plays. There must have had to be a lot of copies given to people, and it's just astounding that all of that is lost except for the final versions in the folio.
Well, the actors only had few scripts. I don't know if you're aware of this, but the actors wouldn't have the whole play. I mean, it was a terrible fact to reproduce a play, because you had to sit there and for ages. And so every actor only had their own part. So you'd have your own part written out with the cue that you'd be responding to just prior to it. So all you'd know when you went into a scene was what someone said before you said these words. You didn't sit down and pore over the whole thing, which makes for a very lively, contingent, wild sort of performance. The other thing they had, which is great, I was looking at these in when we were doing this documentary film in Dulwich College Library, is they had what's called a plot, which you put up on a pillar backstage in the Turing House, which was the story of the play. Act 1, Scene 1, Act 1, Scene 2, this is what happens in the scene. These are the characters in it, and these are the actors in it. So, you know, they literally at moments wouldn't know what play they were in, and they'd rush over to this plot and go, oh, okay, yeah, I've got to go on and do this scene, and that's the story of it. Think of it more like sort of daytime television than in terms of the sense of churn and smashing stuff out, time, day after day after day, new play, new play, new play. And the speed at which they had to rehearse and learn, it was very chaotic, but also unbelievably lively. I mean, unbelievably free and creative. And so the Q scripts, obviously, the actors, they threw them away. We think there were probably prompt copies that were written by the theatre's scribe, who was a man called Ralph Crane. They might have survived. There's a chance that Shakespeare's written manuscript might have been involved, but we're not sure. What we do know rather sadly is that it seems, not sadly but comically, is that it seems that one of the perks of being a printer was that you could take the manuscripts you were working away with you to use in the toilet. Paper was very scarce, so that's what might have happened to Shakespeare's written manuscripts.
Is that why they call them Shakespeare's foul paper? Well, I mean, all of this is so interesting. I mean, when you were saying about they only knew their lines and the cues, I believe that's how Woody Allen at least used to direct his movies, that he would only give the people the scenes that they were in. But the way in which you were describing the churn of it, was there a sense before the First Folio that Shakespeare was a playwright of note? I mean, we know that his books sold well, like Venus and Adonis sold very well, but was he acclaimed as a playwright in his own time? I mean, whether it's Ben Jonson's ego or not. I mean, what was the popularity of playwrights who were then being produced in great number?
Shakespeare, we know, was adored and loved while he was alive. And I think what's really interesting about the 1623 moment, I was hearing Emma talking about this the other night, is that, you know, with every artist, with every celebrity, with every famous person, massively big while they're alive, they die, boo-hoo, you know, it's all very sad, and then just slowly start getting forgotten. And their plays sort of drop off, and interest in them drops off, and they go away. And we know from the records of what was performed at the Globe after Shakespeare died, that the number of performances of Shakespeare's plays just started to drip away. There was more Webster, there was more Middleton, there was more either Beaumont or Fletcher, I can't remember. And they became the sort of new men and the new major voices. So that, again, might have been one of the spurs for creating the First Folio, was his mates seeing him sort of drift away from the centrality of the culture and going, oh, hold on, we need to make sure that this man isn't forgotten forever. And so certainly while he was alive, he was revered, adored, celebrated, and you know, one of the reasons we know that is that in the folio itself, as you probably know, you've probably seen it, in the front page is a great big picture of him. And that was in ways a marketing tool. So that was in ways, look, here's the actor you know and love, this is the face you remember well, buy this book.
And can you say something, because we've talked about Ben Jonson, about the importance and the purpose of the prefatory poem by Ben Jonson, and then in the second folio there are many more prefatory poems, and that's 1632, so that's 9 years later. How these enshrine or establish Shakespeare and as the Shakespeare we then come to know over the centuries?
I think they're fascinating. prefatory material. There's a beautiful, it's rather expensive, but there's a beautiful facsimile of the folio which is on sale out there, which the British Library have just produced. And it's worth picking it up just to look at the prefatory material. There's a long letter from Hemmings and Condell, which is one of the most blunt bits of marketing you'll ever see. It just says, please buy this. Whatever you do, buy this. Open your purses and buy it. And you can just see, you know, how much was at stake for them financially and how much they wanted the thing to succeed. I think with Johnson, it's twofold. I mean, one, you know, Johnson was a bit rent-a-quote and would turn up to the opening of a supermarket and,
so it's like a blurb, like authors give
for
many blurbs on books.
But there are bits of his commendatory verse which are sublime and beautiful, which have sort of locked a certain understanding of Shakespeare into our understanding for all time. And there are certain bits which are a bit sort of clumsy and a bit blurby. And there's other ones, there's one by Diggs, who was a very celebrated translator at the time. It's marketing, essentially. It's sort of, let's get this stuff together and get people interested via that. And it's sort of to be taken as seriously as you take any marketing.
You were talking about the messiness of the production. I mean, if you could describe a little bit how books were produced then, and then also how acts and scenes and stage directions come to be inserted into texts, because it seems everything is very improvisation almost.
Yeah. I mean, they were, you know, a print shop would have been a really busy, bustling, noisy, hyperactive place. Very male, very smelly, very testosterone-fueled, a lot of noise, a lot of charging around. We know they've been able to sort of academically to work out that certain compositors set certain plays and certain sections of plays. We know of one apprentice called John Leeson, who was 16 years old, who is famous because he was just terrible. I mean, he just made mistake after mistake after mistake. And he, I think, set part of Hamlet. So it's a wonderful disjunction between Hamlet, you know, the great masterpiece, greatest play ever written, one of the greatest bits of literature, and this 16-year-old kid who's an apprentice just sort of going, and so there's nothing sort of precious about it, again, which is what makes the whole book feel sort of so full of life. And all by hand. I mean, you know, you would create your form by getting your letters. You'd get capital letters from the uppercase, which is how we get uppercase, and you'd get your other letters from the lowercase, and you'd put them into the form, you'd charge around with that, you'd rub ink over it, you'd put it on the printer, you'd steam it through, and so there's a sense of effort and contact with humanity in every page that you don't necessarily get from a book nowadays. You really sense the sort of effort in it. I think that's it.
Well, one of the things you say about the human effort, I've seen in reproductions of pages of the First Folio that, in fact, you can see fingerprints on the pages. I mean, if we had FBI records dating back to the 17th century, we'd be able to identify them. But the
probably grubby, and the printer was, the first printer was blind.
Blind.
This is, which is not the greatest start as a printer. He was called William Jaggard, and by the end of his life, he was blind. He was a sort of bit of a monopoly chaser. He had a monopoly on printing the 10 Commandments, which went around to every church in the country. He also did theatrical playbills, which is, we think, how he knew the theatre crowd. He wasn't the sort of great artist of printing. He was just like, you know, bash it out, just get it out as quickly as you can. Then he stopped in the middle of printing, and we always try and imagine what this scene must be like. when Hemmings and Condell and whoever else was involved, the man who got the money together, called Edward Blunt, because he stopped for 6 months, and at some point he must have had to tell them that he was stopping for 6 months, because a very big commission came in, and the big commission was a book called A Description of Leicestershire. So Shakespeare's Folio was stopped for 6 months, so that the very important book, A Description of Leicestershire. Sorry, I shouldn't laugh at my own jokes. Frank told me you never get married if you laugh at your own jokes, but I can't help it.
Well, in terms of the text then, as it becomes a more set theatrical document, I mean, obviously it must have been a success in the end, because there's a second folio, there's a third folio, there's a fourth folio, but talk about the presentation of plays at the Globe, I mean, originally, and then the difference that there might have been at the Blackfriars when there's an outdoor theater and indoor theater, and how acts and scenes become sort of set by theatrical practice and then also by printing.
I'm not sure about that. I mean, I think that there was a myth. When I was at the Globe, we built this theatre, the Wanamaker, which is a sort of imagined, with as much academic research as we could, prototype for what a Jacobean indoor theatre would have been. And it's brilliant, it's beautiful. I mean, it's not exactly like the Blackfriars, but it's our best guess as to what a Jacobean theatre would have been. And it's entirely lit by candles, by real candles. We get through we used to get through about 150 beeswax candles for every performance. It's magical, you know, because everything looks better under candlelight, everything sounds better under candlelight, everything sort of flowers into a sort of strange life.
Why are we sitting here like this?
It's not the same. And the idea used to be that the acts were acts because of the length of time it took for a candle to burn down. That's total bunkum. You sort of work that out. And then you needed to come out and trim them and reset them. So I think there would have been breaks and there would have been intervals. Theatre was a much more social activity than it is now. You know, you didn't go to the theatre to sort of get away from your wife who's sitting next to you for the evening, which is what it's become sometimes, it seems. Theatre was a place you went to meet people, to argue, to flirt, to see who else was there, to have fun, to engage. So there would have been more regular breaks, but exactly how it came to be written down, I'm not quite sure. Do you know?
No.
Does anyone here know? We've probably got experts here. I think, is that Stuart? You might know.
Well, just in reading about the First Folio and looking at it, I mean, what you were describing about the messiness, I mean, you don't see divisions, you don't even see sometimes which person or player is actually supposed to say certain lines. It's very, I don't know if it's sloppy or they just didn't proofread it.
It's sloppy. I mean, there are 235 that survive, 82 of which, as I say, are held in the Folger in DC. And what we know with some of them is that there are some that are light-proof copies that they'd run off, and then somebody would say, oh no, you got that wrong, that wrong, that wrong. And so they'd then improve it for the next time they printed it, but they'd never throw away the one that was wrong because it was too valuable, because the biggest expense in it, bigger than the labour, was the paper. Paper was extremely expensive and valuable, so they just pushed those through. So we know that there was a sort of crude proofing, but it was almost always at the level of very, very explicit typos. In terms of getting words wrong, which they did massively, that they just let happen.
I mean, it sounds very much like what you're describing is very much like the setting, the typesetting of Ulysses, and how it was written in English and set by a French typesetter, printer, and that people have been debating for 100 years, you know, what is actually correct in the text. And then in the 80s, when a scholarly edition was published that supposedly cleared up all these things, then there was, you know, attacks on that as, you know, many errors in that, and then the publisher, which had stopped printing the 1922 version and replaced it with this one, had to remove the later one and reprint the earlier one. I mean, so there's been debate about Joyce and Shakespeare and what their texts actually say in the same way, so, or similar.
The great thing is, I mean, because it's literally so strewn with errors, is you can sort of let go of your worries and cares. You know, if you try and go, I must find the perfect thing, there isn't one. I mean, Shakespeare would have, you know, written in a sort of strange state of flow. He would have written at speed. We knew that. I think the phrase was he rarely blotted a line. He very rarely corrected himself. So, you know, it would have flown out of him, but he himself, you know, made errors. There's terrible bits of writing in Shakespeare. There's rubbish in Shakespeare. It's what Peter Hall used to call the first 10 lines of the day. When he'd wake up in the morning and he'd go, oh, what have I got to do? I've got to do this. Oh. And he'd sit down, and the first 10 lines are like, oh. And then after 10 lines, he'd sort of go, oh, it's quite interesting. Oh, yeah. And then, you know, 30 lines later, he was just like that. And he was channeling this amazing human stuff that sort of poured through him. So, you know, if you're overly reverential to it, and if you think there was a sort of perfect, brilliant, beautiful thing, that's not the right attitude to Shakespeare. That's Ben Jonson. I mean, and it's great that Ben Jonson's there for the contrast. You know, he was the person who very, very, very carefully sculpted every word. And I don't know, I mean, some people adore Ben Jonson. For me, it's a little bit dead. Shakespeare couldn't write a word that was dead. It's all life.
The thing that you described at Peter Hall's reminds me when I used to work at one of the newspapers I worked at, the editor of the section basically used to just cut out the first 2 paragraphs of anything that anyone said, because he would say, well, this is throat clearing. So I feel closer to Shakespeare already. But before we go to questions from the audience, if you could talk a little bit about why, I mean, maybe this is more a bibliographic and collector's question than it is a theatrical question, but why did the First Folio become like the Gutenberg Bible as sort of an essential defining text of literary history that people are buying it when it's available for such high prices, and collectors, I mean, like the Folger Shakespeare Library, trying to collect as many of them as absolutely possible? Why the fetishization of this book from 400 years ago?
There's an uneasy history in that. I mean, because it really was pretty steady in value. It first sold for £1. It didn't fly up in terms of price for 150 odd years. And then it was only when David Garrick went sort of hell for leather to create a religion around Shakespeare and to create the whole bardolatry cult, and went to Stratford for 4 days for a massive celebration of Shakespeare, during which not a single word of Shakespeare was said, but a lot of stuff by David Garrick. The bardolatry industry boomed then, but also a certain sort of wealth boomed, rather uncomfortably, a large part of it through the slave industry, which had just been exposed by a wonderful new book by a friend of mine called Farrah Karen Cooper, and Emma's written about it as well, and a certain sort of aggressive collecting of artifacts and aggressive showing off of your newfound wealth and power through books and through various other baubles, became a big status symbol, and the folio was part of that. So that was when it really started gathering value and started accelerating. You know, I mean, I think there are wonderful stories about what happened to these books and the way they've travelled the world and who's had them and what imprint they've left on them. I always think of it as like 235 Maltese falcons that are sort of passed from hand to hand around the world and carry not only their own amazing beauty and power, but they carry the sort of fingerprints and a little bit of the life of everybody that's touched them along the way.
There's in one of Emma Smith's books, there's a reproduction of kind of promotional sales notice of the First Folio for the Frankfurt Book Fair of 1622.
Yeah.
And what's astonishing is the Frankfurt Book Fair still exists. I mean, it happens every fall in Frankfurt. And so the continuity not only of Shakespeare, but then to think that this book was first promoted for a book fair that still exists, I mean, to me, at least as a publishing person, was very interesting. So a footnote to a footnote. But so when you, before we do go to questions, when you look at the First Folio and the other texts of Shakespeare that we began discussing, do you feel that that his friends did him the service that they envisioned that they would be doing for him? I mean, that they had the same idea of Shakespeare that David Garrick did, but before its time, that he was the poet of the nation?
I think it's more touching in a way than that. I think Garrick's celebration was a lot to do with Garrick. I think Hemmings and Condell, it was an act of brothers and an act of friendship and an act of love. I think that the whole book, in ways, is a denial of oblivion. You know, those texts could have disappeared, and they were saved. Just as, you know, in a way, every play of Shakespeare's has oblivion as an enemy. I mean, I think it was Harold Pinter said that, you know, death is the villain in every play, and it's what you push back against. And I think they were just terrified that, you know, their friend had died in the course of the creation of it. Burbage died in 1619. William Jaggard, the first printer, the blind printer, died in 1622, and his son Isaac took over. Anne Hathaway, who I think had some sort of hand in it and then help in it and encouragement in it, died in 1622. So there's all of this sense of loss. And I think it was really important to them that they made sure that these plays weren't lost, that the sort of awful crush of oblivion didn't take the plays as well.
I'm so curious about why you think Anne Hathaway might have had a role in it.
Well, partly because I just loved that book that Maggie O'Farrell wrote, Hamlet, which sort of reinvents Anne, but also Germaine Greer really cleverly and successfully reinvented Anne. And I think that the two daughters are very misunderstood in that we know that in Stratford, under the bust of Shakespeare in Holy Trinity, there's verses in Latin. They were clearly written by Susanna. There's the most beautiful poem on the grave of Anne. I wish I could remember it. It just begins, "Oh, Mother." It's simple, it's plain, it's unbelievably touching. That was written by Judith and Susanna in collaboration. So the story that they're away in Stratford and in some way inimical to the playwriting and to the poetry and whatever, and he's off having a totally separate, glamorous theatre and poetry life in London, it's a bit dumb, I think. I think the edges were much more blurred than that.
And what you just said about the poem on Anne Hathaway's grave, which perhaps was written by one or both of the daughters, harks back to what Catherine Rundell was saying about everyone writing poetry at that time, and that it was a way, a common way of communicating on all sorts of levels. I mean, I think she said something like even on invoices could be written in poetry. So certainly gravestones ought to have been.
Yeah. No, it is. I was thinking when I was listening to that actually, and it's something I write about in this book, which is about a separate issue, is that there are these funny moments when, you know, there's a craze in a society for a certain sort of making or a certain sort of art. In the time of Florence in the early 15th century, everybody was just drawing manically, sketching manically. You know, it was how you were an accomplished young person. It was competitive. People did it to impress each other. People did it as a way of recording their feelings. And out of that, you get these extraordinary artists in Vienna in the early 1800s. There was, I think, the highest concentration of pianists in a single place the world has ever known. Everybody was playing the piano. That was how you, you know, spoke to each other. People drifted from all over Europe who were accomplished at playing the piano just to sort of show off to each other, and no evening was a full evening without a lot of piano playing. And out of that, you get the Beethoven, who was a very brilliant pianist and was one of the greatest of all of them. So what Catherine said earlier made me think of that, is that, you know, suddenly you've got a whole society that's expressing itself in verse. That creates the broad base of a pyramid, and then you get these extraordinary figures at the top.
Including Shakespeare at the very, very top.
And done.
Well, thank you, Dominic. Questions from the audience? There are microphones on either aisle, so please raise your hand. Oh.
Welcome home, Doctor.
Hi there, how are you? Nice to see you.
Given that the First Folio, my friends brought the plays together to commemorate the brilliance, why has there persisted to be a question about whether Shakespeare is a
It's hardly worth considering. I mean, it's sort of flabbergasting, and the number of people that seriously adhere to it is extraordinary. You know, I mean, before Shakespeare died, there are a number of quartos that produced, you know, that just say by William Shakespeare. It's transparent. All of the people around him talk about him making the plays. The plays are often very coincident with what was happening in his life and what was happening to him emotionally, and it's very clear to see the correlation between moments in his life and what's in the plays. It's a sort of strange, willful perversity that you just have to sort of let go and not get too upset by it. Even when, you know, you encounter it at its most virulent, you've just got to sort of stay calm and carry on. My predecessor, Mark, was an anti-Stratfordian, and he used to hold these conferences and so on in the Globe, and I was very keen that Mark stayed in the building and was still a friend to the building, and so I said he could carry on with these conferences. And so he did, and I went to a couple of them, and they're great. They're very funny, because the actual level of history in them was very impressive. You know, it was people that had dug deep into the age and worked very hard to understand the age, and actually they've thrown up a lot of interesting insights. But then the conclusions just sort of got more and more sort of daft and strange. But what was great about every evening was the first half would always be perfectly sort of calm and civil and interesting, and then the second half, the Baconians would get angry with the Oxfordians, who'd get angry with the Herbert people, who'd get angry with the people who thought it was Marlowe who'd come back to life and so on. And they'd end up screaming at each other, and their rage for each other was actually much greater than their anger at people that believed in the obvious reality.
Thank you. It was very interesting and entertaining. I'm curious about the failed drafts, the deletions. You mentioned that paper was very expensive. So were there drafts that on previous sheets of his writing that that were crossed out and something written over that. And I'm glad I don't have to Google you for an answer.
We only have one example, we think, of his own writing, which is Sir Thomas More, which was a play that he only, we think, contributed a sort of a couple of speeches to, because it was a very collaborative medium at the time. Again, like daytime television or, you know, the box set thing where you sort of bring a group of people into a room. You know, the example that we have is very fluent, it is very straight through, it's not, he doesn't stop and revise or correct or cross out. And then I think the other thing that we have is what Hemmings and Condell say in their introduction about, you know, he never blotted a line. But the evidence is unfortunately scant. I mean, we all wish that we could find a written manuscript and learn from it. But they just weren't built to last. I mean, who knows? Who knows? I think the present rate is, I think Emma was saying, it's about every 7 years we discover a new folio. The one fell out of a library in northern France, one appeared in Scotland in a private collection. There are still surprises to come. If amongst those surprises is a written manuscript, it would be a great glory.
Hopefully not like the Hitler diary.
No.
Other questions? Oh, yes, back there.
Would there have been an expectation when thinking about why he didn't make sure this was put into print? Might he have had an expectation that it would continue to live in the theater, that there would be performances after his death, or would he have not have expected that?
Yes, no, I think he would, because I think he had examples of other writers who died, whose work did carry on afterwards. I just think he was forward motion, Shakespeare. You know, the most miraculous thing about him really is the degree to which he reinvented himself play after play after play, and came up with a whole new idea of what a writer could be and what a play could be. I think if you're looking back, if you're worried about your reputation, if you're worried about how you're going down in the world, that all sort of clogs the arteries, which you just want to sort of, in Shakespeare's case, you want to flow freely forward. So that's why I think he didn't care so much about publishing. I mean, I think he would have been, you know, I mean, he would have been competitive, he would have been grumpy if somebody else's play had done better, or was getting more audiences, or was getting more laughs, or was creating more tears. I mean, I think he was human in that way. But he didn't have that need to memorialise himself, to sort of turn himself into a statue, which someone like Ben Jonson does, and you know, which you can see in a lot of artists today. You sort of know when an artist is someone who does want to memorialise themselves, and then you know, well, you know a lot more about this than I do, but you know, with someone like Picasso, who just was compulsive and just couldn't stop pouring stuff out, sort of almost manically, because he just had this desire to create. You can tell which sort of person or artist it is on that spectrum, the Jonson-Shakespeare spectrum. He would have liked the money. I mean, he did like money. I mean, that's, you know, that's sort of one of the more honest and interesting things about him. I think there's another one over here.
Do you have a view on Shakespeare's cause of death, whether that has any, and whether that affected his failure to provide for a collection of...
Well, there's a story that he went out drinking, which is something that people from Charleston will understand. I got hijacked last night, held down by young people who poured whiskey into me. There's a theory that he actually went out drinking with Ben Jonson and another poet called Michael Drayton, who was another Warwickshire poet, and that they had a big night in a village a little far away from Stratford. He didn't get home, caught a cold turned into a fever, and that was what finished him off. His writing was sort of done, though. I mean, The Tempest, as you know, is the greatest sort of farewell to art that almost any creative artist has ever managed. So he'd sort of had waved goodbye, and then, because he wasn't perfect, like all human beings, he sneaked back and did a little bit of work on Henry VIII, collaborated on Henry VIII, and collaborated on Two Noble Kinsmen, because he couldn't let it go. But, you know, they have the feeling of a sort of involuntary desire to sort of still stay in the game. So he was, I think, written out. But I don't think he sought death in any way. I think that, you know, it was something that just sort of came over him. He was old for the time. He was 52. He must have been exhausted. I mean, the size of the place and the size of the achievement must have taken it out of him. And the amount of time he'd spent sort of dancing around power and surviving in a world that was very scary and very... the knives were very sharp, and you know, that would be very tiring. And so I think he was in Stratford. He'd let go. He wanted rest and calm.
On that note, thank you, Dominic.
Thank you two so much. That was amazing and extraordinarily full of facts that I'd never heard of before. I didn't know that about Leicester.
Leicestershire.
Leicestershire.
A description of Leicestershire.
Okay. Well,
That hasn't
it was
lasted, has it?
very cool to learn about that. So I just want to say thank you to Bill Goldstein and Dominic Dromgoole. And I would like to say thank you again to Bernard and Judy Cornwell. And I wanted to let everybody know that this is the last event here at the Dock Street for the Charleston Literary Festival, but there's 2 events tomorrow at the IAM, one at 2 and one at 4, and there's tickets available for sale online. There are signed copies of Bill Goldstein's books for sale in the lobby through Buxton Books, and Dominic Dromgoole will be signing his books in the lobby as well. So thank you for being here tonight, and have a wonderful evening.